On today's episode of Powerview, we're going to be taking a look at banking a little bit further than what we did on our previous episode, focusing on how money gets its value, how the US maintained its world reserve currency, and a bunch of other fun and interesting things, or hopefully fun and interesting things, about banking and the whole world of currency. So, without further ado, as always, I'm Braden. He's Jordan. Together, we are the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview. So, as we mentioned at the top of the episode, we're really trying to start our focus here with how money gets its value. So, it was mentioned in the previous episode on banking and currencies, which I guess now is a couple episodes back. But we talked about the Bretton Woods Agreement. Sorry, what was that, Jordan?
Yeah, sorry. I think it's two or three back.
Yeah, 2 or 3 episodes ago. We talked about the Bretton Woods Agreement and essentially the shift from that to the permanent floating of the US dollar, right? To kind of bring us up to speed with our current climate for how currencies are valued, right? But I think it's like we already kind of touched upon how that whole system worked, but I think it's important to focus on what happened to the U.S. currency once they decided to not be backed by gold, right? How did they, or did they, I guess, maintain their world reserves currency status, right? And how did all those things play out
after,
right?
Yeah, because I think I started poking questions towards the end of the banking recording in that direction. So
yeah, we definitely that episode was very long. For anyone who watched it, I appreciate you sticking to the end. But yeah, we definitely by the end of it, we're trying to wrap things up very quickly and ripping through some stuff. So, with that being said, right, the Bretton Woods Agreement. Again, you can watch that episode to get a little bit more details on it. But this idea kind of near the end of World War II. All other currencies would be backed by the US currency, and the US currency would be backed by gold, right? That's the commodity that would justify the evaluation of that currency, right? And so everyone else was based off of the US's dollar, which gave them the world's reserve currency status, right?
Which allowed them to carry it away from gold.
Sorry, what was that?
Sorry, so that allowed them to carry it away from gold.
Yeah, so yeah, the Bretton Woods Agreement allowed for kind of 99% of the of the currencies to move fully away and just kind of base themselves off of, hey, how much money do we have relative to how much money the US has, based off of the fact that, okay, the US has X amount of gold, they were allowed X amount of currency to be created, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So fast forward, right? We already had kind of mentioned this. The U.S. eventually kind of permanently floats the dollar, meaning that they won't tie their currency's value to the amount of gold that they had in their reserves, right?
Yeah.
Because typically, kind of prior to even the Bretton Woods Agreement, that's how everyone did it, right? It's I kept a bunch of gold based off of the value of that gold. I could kind of create a certain amount of currency that would have to be equal to the amount of gold that we had in our reserve.
Yeah,
right?
So
that was the justification.
100 years ago, before this, the country with the most sitting on the most gold had the most currency, essentially.
Yes, yeah, had the most currency. But more specifically to that, and I think this is what you're saying technically, but they had the most purchasing power. So the sheer like volume of currency, right, whether you had millions or billions or thousands, was almost like the irrelevant factor, because it's this scale to what that adds up to, right? So not to jump around here, but there are obviously currencies like for us in Canada, we obviously we go up to billions and trillions of dollars within
Of
our
course,
economy,
yes.
but for the most part, our largest bill, for instance, is $100. So you're not
Banknote,
buying a
yeah.
lot of everyday goods that are kind of more than that.
With
Obviously,
banknotes,
there are
yeah.
bigger things, yeah. Um, but the reason why we only go up to 100 and not like $1,000 is because your average purchase is not like $1,000, right? As opposed to you can go to look at other currencies where the denominations are maybe even start in the thousands, right? Because there are just so many of them printed.
Yes,
From a
yeah.
dollar standpoint, again, using that term loosely, like currency standpoint, I
Yeah.
guess.
I'm trying to think, maybe like, was it Germany in the 20s?
Yeah, well, so definitely, and we're gonna get into some of that stuff later with hyperinflation. I guess a little teaser in that sense, but
Yeah.
even just from um a standpoint of a government might choose to print more dollars so that more people can have a dollar, but that dollar is worth
Becomes less
less,
valuable.
right? The more dollars you print,
Yeah, it's almost like
but
the
again,
value gets diluted. Yeah, okay.
yeah, yeah. So we're gonna get into all these things. So it'll hopefully make a little bit more sense as we kind of go with this. But um yeah, so the US under Nixon's administration moves away from the US dollar being pegged to gold, right? But being backed by gold. Um that's obviously a really important thing because it's kind of the first time ever that we have currencies globally not being backed by any type of commodity, right? And again, kind of harping back to that episode or a couple episodes ago with the banking currency, that there was always some kind of commodity, so to speak, that was connected to give currency its value. Whether it was the like physical gold coins themselves
Yeah,
were a commodity, right?
yeah.
Or being backed by other kind of things, whether it's the cuneiform tablets. Um, uh, we talked about, I think, like there were some uh, societies that tried to use shells and all these different things, right? Painted rocks, because you were essentially just trying to give something a physical value rather than saying, "Hey, this $1 bill is worth $1," right? Because it's like, okay, what
Correct.
does that
Yeah,
mean, right?
yeah,
But there, it was easier to kind of put a commodity connected with your currency so that there was a bit of a justification for the valuation of it, right?
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, needless to say, this is really kind of the first major time that all currencies were not backed by really anything um, other than uh, and this is kind of like the key overarching story for the rest of kind of currency is that everything comes down to supply and demand, right? Um, and I would
Yes.
make the argument even more than just like supply and demand as a whole. It's really the demand, right?
Yes.
Demand is the number one driver when it comes to how do you value and justify your currency's purchasing power, right? So, as you can kind of imagine, with the U.S. moving away from gold, um, it's a bit of an unknown if you're another country, right? Whether you're Canada or the
It's a
United
faith
Kingdom,
system
or
almost. Yeah, like
yeah, well, because before, if you're like for us in Canada,
mhm.
our money is relative to the U.S. dollar, right? Back
Yes,
um, when it was pegged by gold.
gold. Yeah,
Um, so now, not only how do you evaluate the American dollar, but then you also have a situation of how do you evaluate your own dollar, right? Right? Can I just then print endlessly? Can I uh,
okay.
justify
Yeah,
paying a certain dollar amount versus another dollar amount
yeah.
for goods? So, keeping in mind this whole aspect of supply and demand being that number one driver for currencies, right? um, the U.S. was able to maintain their world reserve currency status, right? Which is something that gets talked about a lot in the news nowadays.
Yes, yes, yeah,
Um, but they were able to do this because of Henry Kissinger, who I'm sure lots of people know
yeah.
that name.
Incredibly still alive somehow. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, he was the oh, is
the secretary,
he? What's it? What's like foreign secretary? I'm blanking on
secretary.
what it would be called
Yeah,
in the United States.
yeah. Secretary of State.
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's
Yeah, I
correct.
think that's what it was.
I think that
I
that's the name
remember
of
because I should know this just because of school, but I remember it mostly from a Call of Duty game
it.
from way back. Yeah,
Yeah. Hey, you know what? Why not? If that's how if you're gonna remember it, doesn't matter how you
yeah. I'm
learned it.
pretty sure. I'm pretty sure Secretary of State. Yeah,
That makes sense in my head when you say it out loud. So we'll go with that. But nevertheless, Henry Kissinger, you can look him up, but he's a real person. um, but he took a trip to Saudi Arabia specifically, kind of as Nixon chose to float the dollar, and was able to kind of get a deal with them and indirectly OPEC, which I mean we can talk about them in a general sense, but he was able to strike a deal with them to have all of their oil sales, right? So obviously Saudi Arabia is a big oil country. If you didn't know that, I guess. um, it's one of their number one exporters. It's the wealth of their entire nation, pretty much. But yeah, so all oil and gas uh, trade.
producers or yeah. Okay, yeah,
Well, yeah, trade is what I guess the word I was looking for. Was going to be done in U.S. dollars. So if they were selling oil, whatever, if they're selling oil to uh, India, let's say,
yeah.
India would have to pay for that oil
In U.S.
in U.S.
dollars. Same
dollars,
thing with like
right?
South Africa or anybody else. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Insert name of country type of thing,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Which is what
So
we're used to today, right? Like everything's traded in U.S. dollars.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And that still up until very recently, not to like kind of jump ahead and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, all um, oil and gas trade was you or was paid for using U.S. dollars, right? And so what that means is that a country like Canada or India or China or whatever, South Africa, would have to take their dollars or like their currency, because obviously
Convert
not
it.
everyone has dollars,
Yeah.
um, and convert them into
To
US
U.S. Yeah.
dollars, right? So it's like depending on the ratio, whether it's a 1-to-1 trade, whether it's a 1-to-5 trade, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But they would have to take their dollars and exchange them for US dollars, right?
It makes you realize how the U.S. economy, like why the U.S. economy is the biggest economy in that sense, right? Like,
Yeah. So
because everybody needs oil. So,
I love that you went there with that, because um, kind of bringing back and reminding ourselves about this supply and demand aspect. If you can artificially create demand for your currency,
mhm.
then you have a lot more wiggle room on the supply end of things, and your evaluation for your currency goes up. So yes, obviously the U.S. Created this deal with Saudi Arabia, and in large part, it kind of got expanded to OPEC because Saudi Arabia controls a lot of OPEC,
Yeah.
uh, which it's the OPEC is the oil producing economies. I
Yeah.
don't
So,
know, something like that. I don't know. It's
OPEC, right? Yeah.
yeah. I was like, what's the
Oil
acronym stand for?
producing. Here, I'll double check. Oh, and by the
Sure,
way,
if you want to
Henry
look it up.
Kissinger.
But essentially, it's a bunch of oil producing countries that kind of have creating a cartel makes it sound like a bad more of a bad thing, but it's essentially that they're all agreeing upon how much they're going to produce, what they're going
Yeah.
to sell it for. It's trying to control the market a little bit more, right? Rather than having some dominant players um, control everything,
Single-handedly
right?
control everything. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
right.
Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. I
Oh, there
should
you
have
go.
known that.
That
Yeah.
sounds way
Yeah.
better than whatever I said. Um, but yeah, hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, because all of those countries were selling and buying, I guess, in theory, maybe, um, oil using US dollars, and therefore most of the world also had to use US dollars,
To
right? Because
purchase
if
their
OPEC
fuel.
is doing
Yeah.
that, if the United States is doing that, obviously, because when they sell their own oil, they're going to make you pay in US dollars, right? Just like any other commodity that they produce in their country.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, you essentially have a bunch of trade that is now showing up using US dollars. So we have this term called the petrodollar, which is kind of we used to have the gold standard, right? And then
Now
it's now
it's the
shifted to the
oil dollar.
petrodollar. So
Yeah.
um and that really does stress home just how valuable um this agreement over oil being bought and sold with US dollars really has, because it's basically saying that now, um, in the case of the US, the commodity that their dollar is being backed by indirectly is really oil.
Oil.
Even though on paper they're not really explicitly saying that, it just ends up working out that way, because if that's how people are buying so many things, or if all the oil is being bought using US dollars, right? Um, that in artificially technically inflates the
The
demand
US
and therefore the economy, right?
for the US economy. Yeah.
Yeah. So uh, going off that, with that higher demand, right? Artificial or not, um, the US is essentially kind of over those years able to justify more development, right? Um,
Yeah.
because the more develop and the more, well, sorry, let me back up a bit. They're able to justify more development because we've just already established that their purchasing power increases because their value of their currency
Everyone's
being
trading
demand
in
goes
their
up, right?
dollars. Yeah.
Yes. Um, I just noticed my camera froze. Maybe it's
Oh, did it?
frozen entirely, but it's coming back. Oh, there we go.
Okay. I was going to say because it lagged a little on my end, but
Okay, there you go. Well,
yeah,
it's
that was
back.
strange. Yeah.
um, so yeah, they're able to justify this growth in the economy, right? Um, through development, right? Because they're able to say, hey, we have all this demand. We now have a higher purchasing power. Even with our supply increasing, right, with the amount of dollars being printed, it doesn't really matter because the demand for wanting to spend those currencies is at an all-time high type of thing, right? My my camera's going wonky. This is what happens when it's on Wi-Fi.
Oh yeah, it just
Nevertheless,
cut
you
it.
guys could still hear me, so that's all that
Yeah, it just
matters.
cut out on mine.
Yeah. Um, I'm gonna keep going, rolling with
Yeah,
it,
yeah, yeah.
regardless. It'll be your pretty face that'll
Unfortunately
just
for
be up
everybody
there.
else, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
um. So yeah. So the more development means more stronger economy. And essentially, it just I think this is like a little bit of a not fully acknowledged the impact on the fact that the real success of America, and arguably like what people don't always realize, is that the US was able to make it look like their economy was way greater because of these oil deals.
Deals, yeah.
And then uh like because they had that initial push, they were able to create a lot more of economic development locally at home, right? Infrastructure, manufacturing, all those things, right?
Yeah.
You see a bit of a, uh, especially kind of going into the leading into the 90s and the 90s in particular, right, where you have this bit of a recovery in the early 80s from some stuff that happens in the 70s, and then
Yeah.
leading up to this booming economy of the 90s. um, that all gets justified because of this kind of evaluation of currency, really, right? So um and it gets kind of doubled or like on itself because of the fact that the US has the trade from all oil. They also then have built up their economy, so then they're doing more trade as well, just on things that are
Overall,
American
yeah,
goods, right? Doesn't
yeah.
matter what it is, food.
Yeah, they have a lot of
Um,
natural resources, right? So
yeah, lots of natural resources, right? So it kind of was the perfect storm for if you're America, that you're now able to leap out ahead of all these other nations and spend more and more money because of the fact that you have, like, if you looked at, like, it's not a part of their GDP, right? A gross domestic product, um, which is essentially like the total amount of goods and services exchanged, right? Like the sale of
yeah,
things. um, it's not a part of that, but because uh, that currency demand is still being utilized globally, right?
yeah.
You have a situation where, in a way, the wealth of the United States includes a lot of
All these other little
those
trades.
oils trades. Yeah,
Yeah,
right. Like, because it is one of those weird situations where they're able to kind of justify, um, on paper. You're like, oh well, everyone wants our currency, so it doesn't matter if we produced it. Like,
yeah.
it's good. It's trade being done with U.S. currencies,
Currencies. Yeah,
right? Because you compare that to, let's say, Canada. Well, Canada is working with the goods that we produce here locally are the only things that are bought and sold in Canadian dollars, right? So
yeah.
if we buy, like, if we create
Domestically, yeah,
like Canadian steel, right? So that's a domestic thing that we do. We refine it, we sell it, whether we sell it in Canada,
or
right,
export
where
it.
it's
Yeah,
like you and I buy the steel, or we sell it to like China or some other country. Um, in doing that, that's the only use, like, demand for the Canadian dollar, right? It's the
correct.
stuff that's bought and sold here, and
Here,
then the stuff that we are able to export
that
from
other
our
countries
creation.
want to purchase
Yeah.
from us. Correct. Yeah,
Very different than the US, who's like, well, Saudi Arabia is producing some oil. They're refining it, they're doing the whole thing, and then they're selling it to the world, and then they sell it in our US dollar. Well, the US had nothing to do with that, but on, like, a
uh
currency side of things, it
they
shows
do.
that they have everything to do with that,
Yes.
right? It's
Yeah.
as if it was their own product.
Correct.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, it's I feel like there's a bit of, um I don't know, currency accounting. I don't know what word I'm
I
trying, or
like that
phrase I'm
term.
trying to look
Right.
for, but, like, yeah, there's a bit of, I don't want to go as far as saying manipulation, because that is how the system works, right? Like, it's supply and demand,
Yes.
right? But because you're able to strike a deal to create demand, right? Uh, you can make yourself look a lot better than you actually are, and then justify, okay, we're going to keep on growing, regardless of what may be even happening domestically, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, hopefully that all may make sense, right? Just this aspect of, um, how the U.S. was able to maintain their world reserve currency status for so long after
Uh,
floating the dollar, right?
yeah.
Kind of shifting from the gold standard to the petrodollar, and then just the implications of that petrodollar, um, allowing the U.S. to just keep growing their economy.
Because everyone's oil is the main form of energy supply, right? So it's no matter who's
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So, like, the it's funny. So in both cases, right, the Bretton Woods Agreement and then floating of the dollar, those are really all about trying, like, for the U.S. trying to justify development within their country, right?
Yeah.
Um, Again, I don't want to go too deep into it, but like obviously with World War II, right? Sure, it's the stability of the U.S. Not being a part of Europe that the chance of gold being stolen is less likely, right? So sure,
Yeah.
that those things are a real aspect of it, but the um, other part of it is really this sense of, okay, if all other currencies are backed by the US dollar, then we kind of can control the amount of growth globally, right? Because
Yeah.
you like
It
the
keeps it
US can't
bubbled.
can't do whatever they want, but then everyone else also can't do whatever they
Can't do whatever they
want,
want. Yeah. So
right?
it's
So it's a little more of an even playing field. And then when they float the dollar, it's like, oh, how do you value something? Well, we now, instead of everyone being backed by our currency, it's now that we're going to justify our currency because we are able to create this demand for it, right?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, because I
and just
remember there was the
how,
oil shortages in the 70s, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And yeah, I remember because I think if you look back, then I think the US dollar like jumped. I can't remember as just from like so many people talking about it to me that like were older than me when they grew up with it, right?
yes, yeah. The
Yeah, it's obviously before our time, so
Yeah, it was, yes, before our time.
I
But
wasn't there.
but yes, the price per barrel type of thing, yeah, jumped.
Yeah,
Uh and then obviously
yeah.
um
The
we've
economy kind of
yeah, because we've
went up
talked
and it
about this, I guess
crashed in
not
the
really
80s.
today, but oil in particular, I mean, touches pretty much like every aspect of our societies, right? Like it's
Yeah,
the number one source of energy slash like product that is used in most of our things, right? Like you want to ship things from one place to the other, you're going to need oil as like an energy source, right? You want to
yeah.
create certain products, well, that takes oil to create that, right? Like it's just everything in our economies are very much so backed by oil because they're
Oil
it's the number one energy source. Obviously
source.
an
Yeah,
energy source is going to be your prime uh
like the most used one. Yeah, the most used resource.
yeah, and most important from that for that
Correct.
matter,
Yeah,
right? Yeah, no, totally.
especially when you
Um,
live in countries where you need heating in the winter, or in
yeah,
other
right.
cases like energy, like or just even like tropical countries where it's like if you don't have air conditioning, like elderly people become like their lives get at risk, certainly like during heat waves and stuff without energy. So it's yeah, when you're
Yeah,
talking about artificial demand, it's almost like it's built into that in that sense. Where there'll always be a demand for the energy because somebody's so dependent on it for the like to live that it's the demand's always going to be there.
yeah, exactly, right.
Oh, yes, it did. It's upside down.
Is it upside down?
Yeah, I was like, it's upside down.
Did I fix myself? There we go. Okay,
Back
I'm back. But
amongst
yeah,
the living.
hopefully with my multiple ramblings of I feel like repeating myself, this aspect of the demand for the US dollar, allowing them to just grow, um and kind of bring us to where we are today, right? Because everyone also is backed by that same logic, right? If you like Canada's dollar is same thing, right? If people want to trade with Canada, both domestically and internationally,
Yeah,
all of those factors kind of get piled together to justify an evaluation of, hey, what is the Canadian economy worth? What is the Canadian dollar worth?
the true
What kind
value
of
of it. Yeah,
development, right? Future development are we able to justify?
yeah.
All of those kind of little nitty gritty factors kind of
Yeah, like
get
here's a you could put it in
snowballed together. Yeah.
like a flip scenario, that like the US has their currency tied to oil, right?
Yep.
Well, you could hypothetically live in a world where no hardwood lumber is traded that isn't tied to the Canadian dollar because we're the largest source of, right. So like,
Yep.
you could, right, if it was in a world where like lumber was the main source of fuel still or something like that, like us in Russia
Yeah,
would be
or
like,
if we
yeah,
really didn't use like bricks to build houses, right? Like, it was
hmm,
like, or steel in general wasn't used to build
yeah,
buildings, right? So it's like, oh my gosh, lumber is the most important thing for any type of shelter. And globally, it's all traded in Canadian dollars. Yeah, that would really boost the Canadian,
hmm,
um,
yeah. It's a
because it's not
hypothetical. So
really
I
the
don't think,
Canadian economy, right? Because the economy is supposed to focus on uh, what is like bought and sold within the Canadian context, but it's the like economics of currency rather than the like Canadian economy that gets
yeah,
affected by that. Where, okay, if now, if my, we always look at like the Canadian dollar to the US dollar, right? So if typically for every Canadian dollar you get 80 cents, let's say, for in the US. Well, now if we have a situation where for every Canadian dollar we get 90 cents to the US dollar, well, that means you can now go and buy uh I don't know what the percentage of that would be going from 80 to 90 off the
90,
top of
yeah.
my head. Was that like a uh I don't know. This is embarrassing trying to do mental math right now. It's like a 7%
Increase, yeah,
increase, or
which
uh,
is
um to go up the 10% there. Um, but yeah, to do that, that's an increase in your purchasing power that you now globally can say, I want to buy a good from India, I want to buy a good from Russia, I want to
Russia,
buy a
yeah,
good from Egypt, and now I'm able to get more bang for my buck, right?
yeah,
So yeah, it's super important. It's really allowed to justify a lot of the success, I would argue, of the United States, um, and kind of,
for sure, that makes sense. Yeah, because they're also
yeah,
themselves a fairly large oil producer as well.
yeah, because they're producing, exactly, they're producing a lot. Other countries are producing a lot, and I don't want to go as far as like, I don't want to jump too far ahead of with things and say we're starting to see a world where uh, if you want to have a cynical view of how the petrodollar kind of functions, in that you're kind of cooking the books, if you understand that expression,
Yes,
where like,
yes, I'm sure. Yeah,
right, like if that's the case, we're now running into a time where, okay, it's 2023, and the justification for the US economy is kind of catching up with itself, right?
yeah,
And countries, there's a mixture of a lot of different reasons for why that's happening, but the kind of greatness that is the American economy is kind of showing its true colors, because if you get rid of um, right? If some of these countries like OPEC, like the OPEC
decide to
nations or
pull out.
China or
Yeah,
whatever, like if some countries are deciding not to do their oil trades in US dollars, again, that it's not the US economy, but it hits the US economy super hard, because the
yeah,
value of our dollar, of their dollar, and their purchasing
drops.
power
Yeah,
globally, yeah, diminishes greatly, right? So yeah, again, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, because then I need to feel
fair.
like I need to
Yeah,
explain all the reasons why we're in that situation and blah 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 blah. But I hope you guys can, and I'm sure Jordan, you probably already know because we talk a lot, but regardless, I hope anyone who's listening is getting the implications, at least, of this idea of a petrodollar, and how to artificially um, control currencies through supply and
and
demand.
value them. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
because I think that it's easy to think, oh yeah, the U.S. dollar, but I think a lot of people forget it's because it's connected to all oil sales.
Yeah. 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 And I mean, I guess the other kind of part that I didn't really touch upon, but when you have the status of the world's reserve currency, um, what that really means is that, in theory, the U.S. dollar is supposed to be the most stable currency in the world,
Yeah.
right? It's supposed to be the equivalent of the store of wealth, right? That
Yeah.
definitely was like the case under the Bretton Woods Agreement because they did not have a choice other than, hey, we have X amount of gold. Gold is worth like X amount of dollars globally. Therefore, our currency is what it is,
Worth
right?
whatever. Yeah.
Um, when the kind of floating of the dollar and the petrodollar comes into play, it still maintains that status because there's kind of a guaranteed amount of trade that's probably going to happen globally, within
Regardless.
a little
Yeah.
bit of wiggle room because of
Yeah.
the whole, oil and gas, as well as just the American economy in general, right? Like all of those factors where it's like, okay, safe enough. I can store my money as American dollars and I'll feel comfortable with that.
Yeah.
So many nations around the world in their own central banks uh, have US dollars, right? Like China is, I believe they are still the like number one country
Hold.
for
Yeah.
holding US
Just all.
treasuries.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Like, so yeah, it's not always in like cash. It sometimes are in like treasury bonds and
Yeah.
whatnot, but um,
It's to your
it's
point though. It's
yeah.
replaced gold in that
Yeah,
sense, right? Like
exactly. Right.
people used to have gold
Yeah, they'll store gold
to
in their vaults.
value, and now
Now it's like, oh,
it's
I'll store US
U.S.
dollars,
dollars.
right?
Yeah.
So that also increases the demand from an American side of things, where you're like, well, like if I'm America and Jordan, you're Canada, and you're like, I'm going to buy some American dollars and just leave them in the central bank type of thing to kind of store some wealth. Um, yeah, I now get to like add that to the like demand side of things and
Yeah.
justify maybe increasing the supply,
Supply of the
right? Where it's
dollar.
like, oh,
Yeah.
so many people want my currency, I gotta add more so that
Yeah.
I can actually purchase all the things that I need, right?
Yes. Yeah.
um but yeah, hopefully you're right, that all
It's
kind of
a
makes
lot.
sense,
Yeah.
and that all that good stuff.
Yes.
um but we're going to slightly shift gears, right? Because I do think that that was really important for kind of how money gets its value today, right? um we talked a lot about it in an American context. Obviously, I hope that should make sense of why we did that, but the general aspect of supply and demand applies to everyone, right? That's the even playing field, so to speak. um that is our currency today, but we also just established that it's not so even at times.
Not as pure as not as it appears. Sorry.
Yeah, not everything is as it seems. But yeah, so shifting slightly, um we talked about how currencies get their value, but now I think it's interesting to maybe talk about how banks get their value, right? Again, this is our part 2 for banking and currency.
So
So
yeah,
we
got the
did the currency
currency.
side of things, now it's the banking side of
That's
things.
it.
um And so we know how money is created. We know that central banks kind of typically are the ones that control that with printing new money. But there's also this aspect of regional slash national banks, depending on where you live.
Yeah, in our case, yeah,
Yeah, like us, it's like our national banks, but then the states, regional banks do it.
regional banks. Yeah,
But it's creating money, like currency essentially, through credit is how they do it, right? Um, and with that is also how banks make their profit, right? So,
yeah.
of course, well, Jordan, I mean, I'm putting you on the spot more just because I know I ramble a lot. So,
No, that's fine.
what would you say, like off the top of your head? Again, I'm really, you weren't expecting me to
No,
ask you
no,
this, but what are the two major things that you would say that a bank is able to make money off of? And I just kind of gave the hint, so to speak,
well,
of
yeah,
they
one,
make money or they create money through credit.
yeah. Well, I was gonna say one is housing and loans.
Yeah. So yeah, the broad term of loans. Yeah,
Yeah,
any type of loan,
loans, and
um,
then
like mortgages,
yeah,
lines of credit.
I would say loans, and then the other one would be like kind of like the basic, like you're storing our money in here, so we charge you a fee.
Yeah, so that definitely uh yeah, that definitely is a part of it. I would say that it's less a part of things nowadays. And the reason being is because uh most banks have like a hey, if you store a minimum amount of money, we're not going to charge you anything, right?
Yeah,
There it's more of a I guess they use that tool as an incentive for you to keep your money with them rather than a
yeah,
revenue source.
coming into
Does
taking,
that
yeah,
make sense? Right? Like, so it's not that you know how we talked about it in the previous episodes, um, that when the goldsmiths started to become like kind of the equivalent of banks, they
yeah,
were storing your wealth for a fee to kind of protect it. Well,
exactly, yeah,
now we look at banks and say like, no, it's your job to protect it, right? Like, so
yeah.
I'm
Okay,
not
that's
paying you for that part of it. Like, that is your existence. If you don't want to protect it, then that's on you, and you don't exist as a bank,
and you don't get
right?
your money. Yeah,
Yeah, right. Like banks that don't protect your money, and again, I'm that's a whole other thing to argue about, so to speak. But in theory, if you're a bank who doesn't protect your customers' money, well, then you will not function or survive as a bank
bank.
because that's
Yeah,
your besides the transaction of goods and services, that is your only purpose for existence, right?
just to keep it
Um,
safe. Yeah,
yeah, it's to keep it safe. It's to store my money. So yeah, the other kind of major one that I like to look at is also credit cards, right? Um,
yes, yeah, lines of
and
credits.
yeah, so they're kind of both the loans and the credit cards. Uh, really, they're working under the same type of mechanic for in terms of how they make money, and it's really just based off of interest, right?
Yes,
Um,
yeah, okay,
loans typically, I mean, it depends on the type of loan, right? A mortgage um, is a little bit more relative to um,
is it the
the
economic?
central banks, like the
Yeah,
prime interest rate.
yeah,
So it's like banks make whatever 2% on top of whatever the prime is.
prime is, yeah,
Um, a line of credit, you might have it where it's more like it can maybe fluctuate a little bit, but maybe that hovers around the like 8, 9, 10%
10%,
range.
yeah.
And then you have credit cards where so this is a little bit like a larger conversation, but credit cards, obviously the two main ones, not that I really want to mention them, but I'll go to it anyways. Visa and MasterCard are probably the
Yeah,
like the
it's
biggest
pretty obvious those two
kind
are
of
the
globally accepted credit cards. And so they are the ones that get to earn all of like the interest, right? Like, so they have a credit card that like if you don't make your payment, then they charge you like 19% on your credit.
yes, yes, yeah.
um
And there's certain like levels of credit cards you can get under each one that the interest rate will change.
yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
but it fluctuates. They're higher interest. Oh, sorry guys, my Reese
Oh,
is
that's okay.
barking.
Oh, is that your dog?
um
Oh, okay.
yeah. uh Now that's all I can hear.
I thought it was my
um
neighbor's dog. Yeah.
yeah, so that has a lot higher interest rate. The other kind of aspect with credit cards is that, like, so obviously, if I'm with TD Bank, right? Well, TD doesn't own Visa, but
Correct.
their
Yeah.
credit cards are Visa. So Visa essentially pays a fee to TD
TD.
so that
Yeah.
TD provides uh,
Their
Visa credit
customers.
cards, right?
Yeah, to their customers.
And
Yeah.
then so they get essentially they're getting a chunk of money, right? So the bank gets money from Visa, so it's not really based off of the interest at that rate. It's more
Yeah.
of just like an agreement on a total amount. And
Yeah.
then
Percentage.
Visa as a credit card company or MasterCard as a card company makes their money off of the interest if you don't pay your monthly
Monthly on
credit.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, like whatever you paid for the or bought for that month.
Used. Yeah.
Yeah, or not, or and they get money from So when you go to, I don't know, the grocery store and pay with a credit card, there is a transaction fee that the your local
Yeah,
grocery store or wherever, right? You can be at a any place that you're paying with a credit card
card.
pays
Yeah,
a fee to either Visa or Mastercard
to
for that
use that
service, right?
application. Yeah, yeah,
Yes. Yeah. So
yeah.
that's how
Because
they drive all their revenue. Some of it gets pushed back to the bank, but as a whole, yeah, you got everything from service fees to credit loan or interest loans
yeah,
um,
okay.
that banks are able to make all this money from, right?
It's all these
Um,
interests from lending money out. Yeah,
yeah, and I think that it's important to know that, in particular, the how banks make money, right, in terms of creating credit or loaning out money, like giving
yeah.
credit to people. Um, because the incentive is essentially there with the fact that they make money off of those loans. Um, it's really, I think, an important thing for us to realize as a society that um, it shouldn't be that surprising that we have all of these situations like in 2008 with like the bank bailouts.
Yeah, Wall
um
Street and everything. Yeah,
yeah, right, like
yeah.
you can even argue about like many times over, both prior to that and even still
Since
currently in our
and since
society,
then, yeah,
right, that uh with the incentive to give people more money in order to make more money back, it's hard to control that flow so that it um
kind of like evenly distributes itself. I guess.
yeah,
Yeah,
evenly distributes and doesn't increase the economy at too high of a pace, right? That the economy isn't justifying that new influx of currency, right? Because we've
currencies.
already
Yeah,
just established that currencies are all based around supply and demand. But if you're a bank, your job is to increase supply
why?
from a business standpoint, because when you
So you
increase
bring
supply,
more.
you're
Yeah,
able to increase your own profit margins.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, it is a, I don't know, it's one of those things that you're like, I feel like we've overlooked this a little bit here, right? Like that this aspect of maybe we should have not put these two things so closely together, in the sense that like something that we don't want to have happen where it's like, oh, like print all this money and give it
Yeah,
all these loans and all this stuff, but then at the same time you're like, well, that's their only purpose, right? Like if
it's
banks were completely centralized, like top to bottom, that there was no TD Bank, there was no Bank of America, there was no
just
whatever.
branches one
Yeah, if you
name.
just
Yeah,
had the National Bank of Canada and the National Bank of the United States, and that was 100% of banks were like that, I think then you could maybe have a world where banks aren't making profit because it just would be like a government
they're
like
localized. Yeah,
agency type of thing,
yeah,
right? Like, yeah, it would be funded by the government, and it would just be this purpose of uh trade, I guess, for
yeah,
that matter.
yeah.
Um yeah, like a method for executing exchange. Um but yeah, we don't live in that world. And so we have a situation where you're like, oh, let me push these loans on people. Or I think the big one is always credit cards, right?
Big time. Oh
Um,
yeah, and like yeah, they catch people that way because you get them young, right? And it's oh look here,
yeah.
you
And
can
because you're
borrow
not really,
$3,000 and
yeah, because
yeah,
you're like
you
$3,000.
need your first
Sweet.
car. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you
Like
need your first
I'm going
car.
off to
Yeah,
university or
yeah,
whatever, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Um, yeah, it is like, I think it is super interesting because you don't have anyone who's really teaching how to use a credit card properly. And
yes,
then you have situations where it's like, okay, I either will hear from someone who says, oh, don't use a credit card at all. Like it'll ruin your life. And that's true for some people because some people don't know how to use a credit card.
yeah,
Right. But then the reality is uh, credit cards are great because it's a way to delay your payments, But
and
you
build
shouldn't be buying things on a credit card that you don't actually have the ability to pay off in the
pay
first
off.
place,
Yeah, if you can't pay
right?
it off in 30 days or whatever, 60
Yeah,
days, sometimes you
right?
get those like 45-day ones. Yeah.
Well, yeah, well, but because it kind of works like if you bought something at the beginning of a month's like a credit card cycle, you're
Mhm.
not paying it for close to
30
60 days
days.
type of thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Because by
exactly.
the time the bill comes in, and then you have whatever 15,
So
20,
many
30
days to pay
days
it.
to
Yeah,
pay it,
exactly.
right? So it is a great way to manage your finances, not to mention to build your credit, which is like useful for if you want to go and get that loan for like a mortgage
Yeah,
for a
because they
house
look
or
at your history of
right.
how
So
you pay things back.
yeah, did you pay it off? Are you utilizing all the credit?
Yes.
So
And then they
it's
like, yeah,
super important, but it's one of those things that most people don't use credit cards like that. They don't
no,
use
no,
they
it's go on
either
going on
it's
a
like, "Oh,
trip. Yeah.
I yeah, right? It's like I'm putting it on credit because I actually can't afford it, right? Like rather than like I'm putting it on credit to build my economic portfolio wealth,
Yeah.
if that
Yeah.
makes
See,
sense,
it's like,
right?
if it's like the start of a billing period and you're maybe like a week out from a payday and you're like, okay, well, I need $40 worth of groceries.
Yeah, right?
Put it on your credit card. And then within 7 days, you pay that $40 off. And
Yeah.
then and then that's how you build healthy credit.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Right? Like that it's sad, and we talk about this a lot with kind of looking at our education system of what do they actually teach us, but it's sad that something like that is not prioritized.
Yeah. Well, they only
uh
stopped collecting interest on student loans here like 2 years ago. It was
okay,
about
yep.
that, roughly, right?
Yeah,
I'm just about to finish paying mine off, and I'm
I
thinking
know,
about
right?
it, and like that was 2 years ago. But for someone like me, or like I guess there's probably a
Anyone
lot of
older.
people like me,
Yeah.
yeah, like in that like middle to end of like the millennials, where you're like, yeah, it's
Yeah. Yeah, where your costs for
yeah,
schools were quite high,
yeah.
and
They
then
got
you
rid of
also
the
had
interest payments 2 years ago, but if I think of it been out for 8, so that's just call it 6 years of paying interest. Like at this
yeah,
point, the very little bit I'm left paying is probably the interest I've accumulated over the 7 or 8
yeah,
years. Yeah.
right? Yeah. It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
So
See, in our case, that's the government copying the bank,
yeah, for them to
make money the
make
same way.
make money off of you
Yeah.
going to school, which is a whole other conversation that
We'll
I'm
save
sure
for,
we'll
yeah.
we'll tear up some other time
So
and be
another
like,
can of
what are we
worms.
doing
Yeah.
here, people?
Yeah. That's a
um
different dish.
yeah. um I know, like, I want to be conscious of time, even though we have episodes that go way later than this.
Yeah. Yeah.
But um it's the long weekend for Jordan and I today, so I'm sure there's
Yes.
lots going on.
Yeah. So if you're in
But
England, it's not a bank holiday where we are.
no, no. Um, and again, this is at the time of recording, so who knows when this will actually air. But I want to slightly kind of shift gears, kind of combining the two things together, right? Like how currency gets its
And
value,
then
and then how like kind of banks function with making profit and all that kind of
profit.
stuff.
Yeah.
And
Loans
Jordan,
and
you already
interest.
really talked about it earlier, but it's the context of hyperinflation, right? You were talking
Yes.
about like Germany in the 20s
'20s.
and
Yes.
like I don't know, like
They kept printing
I
money
think
until the
it's like
value became next to nothing, and then you had like
Hungary in like the end of, I don't know, World War I or World War II. One of the, I think
one.
World War II. One,
I
maybe
think it
one.
was one. Yeah,
Yeah.
because
Nevertheless, there's examples of countries that have gone through hyperinflation.
inflation. Yeah.
Of course, hyperinflation. Everyone knows what inflation is nowadays, especially because we've had our episode on inflation. So if you haven't checked that out, but hyperinflation is that extreme version where it's like your money overnight just becomes worthless. It's like,
Just tanks.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah, for something that used to cost you $1 is now going to cost you $10, right? Like the the
Yeah. And
cost of things is just astronomically just
yeah, in the
blown out.
Germany case in the '20s, it was like million Reichs was like the cost of a loaf of bread.
Yeah, right. Where you're like,
Like,
how do you even fathom a scale like that, right?
yeah, yeah.
And that's why a lot of currencies even fail, right? Like that's why the
It's happened a lot throughout. just in
Yeah,
the last 100 years or so. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so yeah, we kind of already, as we kind of talked about in this episode, we probably talked about it in the last episode. Um, but what we have today are called fiat currencies, right? FIAT,
Yeah,
fiat.
like the car.
Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and so what those are, it's just essentially it's currencies that are not backed by any kind of commodity. It is simply focused on supply and demand. Um, the role, of course, of central banks, um, they are the main driver for when it comes to determining the value of a country's currency because they're controlling the supply for the most part, right? Obviously, we established banks do that as well. Um, but whether it be central banks or the like regional national banks situation, if they don't regulate their currencies, aka the amount of currencies they are putting into circulation, which we've kind of seen in recent years with the
Yeah.
COVID stuff. I'm sure that word's going to get flagged, but nevertheless, with all of the policies around um, printing currencies over the last few years, and many examples prior to that, you run
Yeah.
the risk of inflation, and at worst, it can lead to
Hyperinflation.
hyperinflation,
Yeah.
right? Um, that's a huge sticking point, I think, when it comes to leading back to this idea of how do banks make profit? Well, it's making money. And
Collecting
because they
interest.
don't
Yeah.
all, sorry, what was that?
Oh, it's like collecting interest. Yeah.
Yeah, collecting interest and all that stuff. But I think the key kind of connecting point to focus on is that uh, whether it's a central bank or a regional or national bank or credit card companies or whatever it may be, um, these groups are not necessarily communicating all together with like the government at large and saying, hey, this is our policy of like how we want to have things
Yeah. Can
like
you work
play
with
out,
us? Yeah.
right? Yeah. So if you have some banks being like, oh, I just need to make profit, well, so I'm going to keep pumping out loans, right? And just like whatever, we'll charge a higher interest to justify it, even though they might not have the money for it, right?
Yeah.
Or whatever it may be, right? Like the 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 central bank is like, oh, we have to bail out people because there's a pandemic, or oh, the banks or Wall Street needs bailout. All these massive companies have like overspent, so we have to print a lot more money, or we have this big infrastructure project that we're trying to do, right? Green
Yeah.
technologies, maybe we're pumping stuff in, right? All of those things cost money. All of those things ultimately are going to probably increase the money supply,
Rather than
rather
decrease.
than
Yeah.
simply just, hey, we have all this money just sitting over here, let's just spend some of it,
Yeah.
right? um, we live in a society of debt, and that debt kind of keeps building upon itself, and if we're not careful, that debt will tip
You're
us
going.
to a point where our money is just kind of worthless, right?
Yes. Yeah.
um,
And then you do have those scenes in like the Weimar Republic days of the
yeah, with
wheelbarrow
the
full of
wheelbarrow
cash.
type of the
Yeah.
situation where it's like, all
And
right,
he's
I'm
just
ready to
going
go
to get
grocery
like,
shopping.
yeah, he's like just going to get like a newspaper.
Yeah, right. Yeah, you just start burning the money
Yeah, that was the other. You
for
see
warmth,
kids in
right?
the, yeah, the kids burning cash to stay
Yeah,
warm. Yeah.
yeah. Picture the Great Depression, but on like a almost even scarier scale at sometimes, right? Like, because
Yeah. In
it's
that, yeah, in
yeah,
that sense, because yeah, that was
because it's
total
not that
economic.
money isn't available; it's that your money
It's
is
not worth
worthless.
anything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So scary
It's,
stuff.
yeah.
But kind of the only other thing that I want to point out with hyperinflation in particular that I think is somewhat interesting, um, is that typically this is something that will happen when a government has to print more money to pay off its debts, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of times governments can get away with, okay, we're going to print money, but we're paying off, like we're just buying new things, right?
Yeah.
We're putting an influx into the economy. It's only when those debts come due, and like, so right, with the Weimar Republic, obviously it's the kind of punishment after World War I, right? Whatever, there's lots of different examples about that, like that, but it's this idea that the government all of a sudden has to pay out a large lump sum.
Sum of money. Yeah.
Yeah, that the only way for them to do it is to dilute everyone's currency. And so you and I aren't going to get more currency, but if the government prints overnight a bunch of currency, then yours and my money is now worth a lot less. And
Yeah.
so they may have paid their debt, right? Because it's like, oh, they owed billions of dollars, and so they had to pay it all off. But then now something like the scale is all off, right? So you're having a situation where, like we said, like that loaf of bread is $1 million or whatever, right? Depending on how extreme of a situation it is.
Yeah.
Um, it only really kind of catches up to you when a government has to pay off a bunch of things. That's why governments are able to utilize a bit of a system where they can kind of just live in debt, like they use
And
debt to pay off debt type of situation,
yeah.
right? And that works to a point, but then eventually if you have too many things that come due at the same time,
Then you have to pay them all.
now you have to just make a decision of like, okay, well, how are we going to do this? Like, if we just keep getting more debt to pay off the debt, well, like maybe not,
Sometimes
right?
that's what
Like
they do, but
maybe
yeah.
we're going to actually have to figure something out. And that's where economies just crumble under that kind of pressure.
Pressure. Yeah.
And it's really kind of harps back to this idea of like credit and creating money, because right, all money is fiat currency. It's really just based off of supply and demand. There's no commodity that is connected to it. But it stresses the importance of putting money towards productive assets. So you want to be putting our money towards things that are going to produce for like a GDP standpoint. Like if you're putting in infrastructure things that they're going to allow for businesses to flourish,
They
or if you're going
build,
to
yeah,
fund actual businesses, then those businesses are going to produce a lot in the economy and buy and
and
sell.
sooner and quicker, and
Yeah, right. Yeah, it can't be way down the road, right? We want to have a return on investment as
yeah,
quickly as possible.
ROI,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, right. A little ROI for sure.
yeah.
We want like countries still have to run themselves like businesses at the end of the day, even though they have a lot more tools at their
Disposal, yeah,
disposal. Right, a country's not really going bankrupt, right?
no,
But they will have a temporary situation where their economy is kind of crumbling
it needs
because
to shift its focus in a way,
yeah,
yeah.
right. Um, but yeah, I feel like I've rambled
No,
as I
yeah,
always do, and
no, made it a little clearer
shared
for
a
me
lot of
too.
information. But yeah, I don't know, do you have questions? Anything you want to add, like that kind of
No,
stuff?
I think I asked all the ones I think I had because I
Okay.
was learning stuff as we were going here. So
Yeah, I was gonna say some of these things are not necessarily common knowledge, right? Like others are. I mean, I'm sure lots of people have heard about like the petrodollar and all that kind of
yeah,
stuff, but
no, it's just interesting. Yeah,
hopefully packaging it all together gives you a bit of a sense of, hey, this is what our money really is. This is why some countries are able to do things than others are not. This is the fragility of like how fragile our economies can be when it comes to money, because of the fact that, hey, we have a lot of parties that are able to utilize money, but they're not all communicating with each other,
yeah,
right? Including going as far as, right, with a situation like the pandemic, like a lot of money was printed. It didn't necessarily all go to the places that it should have, right? Even
yeah,
something as simple as like if you and I got money, right? Like there's a chance that you and I chose to go on a trip, or we chose to go buy a new, I don't know, like pools really were popular, right? Because you couldn't
yeah,
go anywhere. So it was like
yeah.
something
You just
like
get
that,
your own
right?
little vacation spot in the backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So it wasn't, that money wasn't going towards, oh my goodness, how am I going to put food on the table?
yeah. It
Right.
was going towards commodities. Yeah,
Yeah, like just like luxuries and things like that,
yeah,
or if it's from a business standpoint, maybe it was going to CEOs bonuses, or right, like, and I'm not saying that that's across the board,
yeah.
but the
No, but it's
reality
just an
is it
example.
happened.
Yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
right, like, so for every company that needed it to be able to pay their, I don't know, restaurant workers that weren't able to work, you also had another company who was doing fine and just was like, sweet, we're gonna put that on the revenue side of things, right?
Yeah, yeah.
um and go from there. But yeah, I'm sure I'm going to go back through this episode and just hear my dog barking the whole time. The
It
house
was the
has gone
last.
crazy.
When did she start off again? It was about
I don't
15
know.
minutes ago or so.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to apologize again because there's probably no way I'm getting rid of that. I'm not
No,
I'm
no, no.
not that tech savvy with all the
It's
multimedia stuff
it's like
that
the
is
cicada.
required.
Yeah, it's like the cicada I can hear right here. It's just some things.
Yeah, right. Yeah, some things we're just gonna have to accept, but hopefully it won't be too bad when you guys come and listen to this. But yeah, hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. Um, as always, right? Have these kind of conversations, learn new things with your friends and
Yeah,
family.
chat it out. Yeah.
Yeah, we love to do that here. And yeah, I guess with that being said, as always, I'm Braden. He's Jordan. We're the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview.